About the origins of COVID-19. China has always insisted it started naturally and spread from bats to humans, but there is a growing evidence that it leaked from a lab in Wuhan, and the clock is ticking to find the truth.
It would seem entirely reasonable and sensible that the world would want to have an independent assessment of how this all occurred.
It comes from China.
China, we believe, was singled out for the review. We don't think it is fair.
Millions of lives have been lost and billions of lives changed forever. But how the COVID-19 pandemic began remains a mystery. With a new US intelligence report handed up to President Biden this week, not yet ready for public release, according to White House spokesperson Jen Psaki.
I would say that it typically takes a couple of days, if not longer, to put together an unclassified version to present publicly, and obviously the president would be briefed first.
The report was said to examine whether COVID-19 could have started in a Chinese lab, and despite the findings said to be inconclusive, Beijing has lashed out, accusing the United States of scapegoating China and telling the Americans to invite the investigation into their labs. The politics playing out as the medical community continues to advocate for a full and open inquiry.
It's not about finger-pointing at all.
Last year, Dr. Nick Petrovsky of Flinders University and his team began modelling COVID-19. Their goal was to fast-track a vaccine discovery, but what they found went to the origins of the pandemic and whether the virus had really begun in animals before jumping to humans.
What our modelling showed was, in fact, that the virus from the very first cases was essentially, perfectly adapted to infect humans and transmit between humans. That's just not the normal situation and does raise the question of, did this human adaptation come about inside a research laboratory somewhere?
There are two leading theories at the centre of the question, where did COVID come from? The nature theory, that the virus began naturally in an animal, most likely a bat, before transferring to humans. Then there's the lab leak theory, that it got out from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where experiments were being conducted on bat-related viruses.
The origin of COVID-19 was a zoonotic spillover from animals to humans.
Dr. Maureen Miller is an infectious disease expert from Columbia University in New York City. Dr. Miller has worked with Dr. Shizheng Li, the director of the Wuhan Institute, whose work on bat-related viruses has now come under scrutiny.
My experience working with Sheng Li is she is bright, curious, conscientious. She's a hard taskmaster.
I think one can start off with a matter of geography.
Nicholas Wade spent 30 years as the science writer for the New York Times and has recently collected evidence, he says, that supports the lab leak theory. In his upcoming book, Where COVID Came From, Wade says the first cases of COVID-19 may have been 3 Wuhan Institute workers who were hospitalised in November 2019 with a then mystery illness, according to a US intelligence report. Wade also says that the type of bats scientifically linked to the outbreak live far from Wuhan.
The bats that harbour the closest known relatives of SARS-CoV-2 hang out in caves in Yunnan.
International laboratories work within a 4-step system of biosafety levels, or BSL, with BSL-4 being the strictest.
Dr. Shi performed all her experiments at the much lower levels of BSL-2 and BSL-3. So BSL-2 has been compared to the safety conditions you'll find in a dentist's office. It's not very high.
Early last year, a group of doctors signed a letter published in the respected Lancet journal, writing, "We stand together to strongly condemn conspiracy theories suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin." This was February 2020, barely 6 weeks after the first reports of COVID-19.
This was a case of scientists so wearing their scientific expert hat, which in fact went far beyond any possible knowledge they had.
American Dr. Peter Daszak was amongst the authors of the letter. Since it was published, it's emerged that at the time, Daszak had connections with the Wuhan Institute.
The National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Washington, gave a large grant to the Wuhan Institute of Virology via Dr. Daszak. So Dr. Daszak was the principal investigator of this grant and stood to be blamed if indeed the virus had escaped from the lab. This conflict of interest was not explained in his letter, and indeed the letter ends with the words, "We declare no conflict of interest."
Earlier this year, China allowed a team of WHO-backed investigators into Wuhan. Who would be on that team? Dr. Daszak. And the team would find that lab leak theory was extremely unlikely. Not surprising, considering Daszak had already come to that conclusion 12 months earlier in the Lancet journal. But without further Chinese cooperation, finding the truth might still be some time away.
Yeah, it'd be nice to know the truth, wouldn't it?